Let us pray. No, I'm kidding. Just kidding. I was just kidding. I just wanted to see if you would. So thank you all for coming out. I was saying earlier to my my dear panelists here, like, who will come? There aren't that many millennials here. In Aspen, that is. Oh, there they are. They're at the millennial table. They're in the cheap seats. And then it was pointed out to me, no, it's going to be all of the like grandmas saying, how do I get my granddaughter to go to church? And we're going to solve that for you. If you leave here after an hour without knowing how to deeply engage your millennial child or grandchild with a faith community, the Institute will give you all $3,000 back for the week. So there, you have my promise. But we won't really know for 5 or 10 years if they've been deeply engaged in the community. But you have it on my assurance. My job is to facilitate conversation between you and these 3 people whom we're very, very excited to have. Jordan Alam is a writer and founder of Perfect As I Am, an Asian American online social justice publication. Naomi Riley, I flipped 2 of them. Naomi Riley is a New York Post columnist who writes a bi-weekly column for the Post. And she's the author of Got Religion, How Churches, Synagogues, and Mosques Can Bring Young People Back. I should say that when I knew her, when we were debating against each other in high school, she was Naomi Schaefer, but she's become Naomi Schaefer Riley. So. Also here today is Jane Shaw, who is the Dean for Religious Life and Professor of Religious Studies at Stanford University. She's an Episcopal priest and the former, is rector the right word? Dean of Grace Cathedral. What's a rector?
Head of a church.
It's lower status.
It's low, so dean's higher. Sorry, I didn't mean to downgrade you.
It's you can, so I'll get.
15 years I've been covering the religion beat, and I still can't get these hierarchies correct. And then finally, we're excited to have Casper Kuile, who is a student at Harvard Divinity School and at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He is training to be a minister specializing in ministering to non-religious people. We're going to start by investigating the purpose of this panel. Why do we need a discussion of millennials losing faith? Naomi, what do the numbers look like? What are the trends out there that bring this full room to us today?
Oh, thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody, for having me today. So I want to actually start by fast forwarding a little bit. A few years ago, I wrote a book about interfaith marriage. And interfaith marriage is very much on the rise in this country. And I did a survey. And what I found in the survey was that the older you are when you get married, the more likely you are to marry someone of another faith. And it turns out that I think one of the reasons for that is this period that we now refer to as emerging adulthood. It's getting longer and longer. We leave our parents' house, or we move into the basement at least, and we spend this more than a decade now going from job to job and city to city and roommate to roommate, and often that has always been a period of religious disengagement. It's just that that period was much shorter, which is to say you might leave your parents' house at 21, and then you would get married and settle down by 25. Now the average age for first marriage in the United States for women is 27, and for men it's 29. It's even higher if you're college educated, and forget about if you've gone to graduate school. So the question is, now we have this long period of time where people are living away from religious communities. They're out of the habit of religious life. And it's no wonder that a lot of them are not coming back. So a recent survey, or the Pew survey, found that about a third of millennials, or that is a third of people under 30, say they practice no faith. They classify themselves as none. And before we move on, I just want to kind of clarify a little bit of what that is. Those are not necessarily people who are atheists. They're not even necessarily people who don't pray on a regular basis. In fact, there's actually a lot of continuity if you look at previous generations in terms of the personal faith practices of people, like whether they say they believe in God, whether they pray on a daily basis. What's changed, though, is their relationship to religious institutions and communities. And so I hope that we're going to be able to talk a lot about that today, because I think in some ways people will say, oh, well, that's just the outward sign of religiosity. But obviously, how these young people are interacting with religious communities has great effect not only on the strength of those communities, but also, I think, on the strength of civic life in America, and also, on their own lives. So with that kind of background in terms of how we got there.
Well, I think that's a great segue into what I wanted to ask Jordan about, which is that one of the things that we did, I was going to say we do, but of course I'm 40, so I'm well past it. It's in the rearview mirror. But one of the things that these kids do when they're out there in their 20s is they often attach to multiple different identities. So, for example, the community you work with, people who identify as Muslim, but also LGBTQ or queer, or does that factor into how they then, if and when they attach to communities of faith or to religious traditions, do the fact that they have other identities, does that become a source of competition or of kind of fracturing their sense or taking them away from Islam or Judaism or things like that?
Right. I think for me, I've met a lot of people through working with the LGBT Muslim Retreat, which is an annual retreat. It's been on for about 5 or 6 years now. There's a lot of folks that find challenges reconciling Islamic faith or deeply conservative types of Islamic faith, which many folks have grown up with their queerness or with their even just gender identity or being a woman in a patriarchal household or, so many different identities that get melded into the mix obviously are equally important. I think that at the retreat, for instance, we have a lot of discussion about what it means to reconcile those two things, what it means to bring together Islamic practices, reinterpretations of Quranic script, reinterpretations of how our communities function, and whether it's important to do those same sort of markers of religious works or practices or faith, such as going to mosque every week. If you live near a hostile mosque, the only available option is a conservative space. Is it better that you just pray yourself? Or if you, move away from the external markers of religion, like you take off the hijab, for instance, if you were a hijabi, does that make you less Muslim? These are the questions that we kind of work with when we're trying to integrate all of those identities together.
Mm-hmm. And Jane, you must see this with the students entering Stanford and how they identify. How do you know how they identify? I'm curious if there's a survey.
Yes,
so when
there
I entered college, we got a little postcard with the packet in the summer before we entered college, and I think it had the survey of, do you want a roommate who parties a lot or is very studious? What kind of roommate do you want? Do you identify with a faith tradition? And there was a postcard, and it was the chaplain's card. How do you know what the students are interested in now? And then how do you minister to them once you know that?
So we know because another office, an Office of Statistics at Stanford, does send information out with the admissions package. And in the last set of numbers that we've got, 54%, about half of the students responded. So, and out of that 50% of the total number, I can tell you that only 3% identified as none, okay, which is the same number of people who's identified as Buddhist. I can give you some other statistics if you like. Do you like statistics? Okay, all right, I'll just go through them. 13% Protestant, 18% Roman Catholic, 10% another kind of Christian, which could be Mormon or Orthodox, 3% Hindu, 6% Jewish, 2% Muslim, some other religious, spiritual, or philosophical tradition, 1%, spiritual but not religious, 6%, atheist, 12%, other, 24%. So you can see it's quite a high proportion of sort of other, non-spiritual but not religious. So as someone who is embedded in a tradition but nevertheless runs an office for religious life, which also has, we call it the Office for Religious Life, but apparently our remit is to sort of oversee spiritual, ethical, moral life too, which is only a small thing, of course, on the campus.
So if students cheat, you have failed.
No, we don't. We'd have to do that.
Ethical superintendent.
Office for Student Affairs does that, actually, interestingly. They have to look at people, the kids who've cheated. We think about how we respond in various ways to those students. And so I stand in a particular tradition, but obviously work with all these different students. And I'm very interested in the ways in which people who identify as none or spiritual but not religious, want pathways into some form of tradition. So one of the things that they also do on the survey is there's a little qualitative narrative element too. And people often say, well, I grew up with a Jewish mother and a Christian father, but actually I'm really interested in Buddhism, right? Or I love to do yoga meditation, and therefore might be interested in Hinduism, but I don't know. So I've got a whole string of those sentences I can.
Funny how people like that always end up in California. It's like
all right, yeah, we can fine. Indeed. So it's not a super religious campus, I think, what I want to say, but it is a campus that's interested in being spiritual but not religious, I think. So I'd love to give a couple of examples of that if I have time.
No,
Do I
sure.
have time?
Yeah. It'll just come out of Casper's time, but that'll be fine.
No, because I think he's going to do
just
the
kidding.
other side of the coin. So
I'm
I want
kidding.
to
You
say
go ahead.
these before. So neither of them actually comes from my time at Stanford, but they both illustrate the point. When I was doing a similar job at Oxford, I ran a thing called the Forum, where I got various kinds of people to speak about, stuff that they were interested in that might have a slight relationship to religion. And I got Philip Pullman, the novelist, who is quite a well-known atheist, wrote this fantastic trilogy of novels called His Dark Materials, which is really a rewriting of Milton's Paradise Lost. And he wrote a book called The Good Man Jesus, the Scoundrel Christ. So I got him to come and speak in the chapel. Hundreds of kids came in because they'd all read his other novels. And it was terrific, and he talked about this, and it was a sort of imaginary gospel. That's what he'd written. And as I walked out, I heard one student say to another, do you know, that was really interesting. That sort of sounds like a great gospel. Maybe I'll read the others now. So that was a story for me about how literature or the arts are a pathway into thinking about story and narrative and tradition. The other example comes from Grace Cathedral, where in 2010, we had 50 people doing yoga on the floor of the cathedral, and by 2014, we had 850 people doing yoga on the floor of Grace Cathedral.
And was this Episcopally inflected yoga?
No, not at all Episcopally inflected.
Okay. I'm serious. I mean,
No, it wasn't. It was just a very good yoga instructor, and people wanted to be there in a beautiful space. We had a lot of different changing art installations, one of which was a very big installation of ribbons coming down, and people loved doing yoga under that space. But what we discovered, it was a bit like Amazon, really. You know how when you buy one book from Amazon, they say, oh, if you like that book, you might like this book. Well, it's a bit like that. If you like yoga in this very beautiful sacred space, you might like the Labyrinth walk on a Friday, and that means you might like the Eucharist around the Labyrinth on a Sunday. Or actually, you might think about getting married in here. So it's about what is your... I think people don't necessarily know what pathway to have into a tradition, but they often want one. Right. So I think you're going to say the opposite of that now.
Well, right. I mean, and you're going to, Casper, you're going to get ordained in a tradition, but then you're going to minister to the nuns.
The nuns,
N-O-N-E.
yes.
When we say nuns, we don't mean
inhabit.
N-U-N-S.
Yeah.
We mean N-O-N-E-S.
Yeah.
And
That's a real shrinking group, the N-U-N.
The N-U-N, right?
Yeah.
There are way more N-O-N-E-S than N-U-N-S.
Yeah.
But I'm one of those people who grew up without a tradition. I'm English as well, and it's a largely secular country. And as a gay man, definitely religion was something frightening and dangerous and irrelevant in my life mostly. And I became very involved with activism and realized that the people I most respected seemed to be people who had some kind of spiritual something. They meditated, so I was like, okay, it's not all bad. And I came to Harvard to do a public policy degree and kept meeting people from the Divinity School who did not fit my expectation at all. And so I enrolled, and I thought, well, I'm an atheist coming in. I'm just going to learn about religion from a distance. But then I realized what I've always loved doing, which is bringing people together, is really a form of ministry. And what my work has been so far is kind of mapping how in very secular spaces like fitness communities like CrossFit or SoulCycle, or in arts communities, things like the Moth podcast, they're replicating a lot of traditional religious functions. So there's one organization called the Millennial Train Project, where they travel around the country learning from different places, sharing stories. And I was like, well, isn't that like a pilgrimage? Or a SoulCycle kind of 45-minute class with different pieces of music, different lighting, different words being spoken, and kind of, inhale, inspiration, exhale, expectation, while everyone's cycling. It's kind of liturgical. And so what I put together a little report, which there are many copies of here if anyone's interested, where we kind of map the DNA of these kind of communities and say, well, maybe even if these don't think of themselves as religious, nonetheless, people are bringing their real lives to these communities. And actually, it's quite a ministerial responsibility to lead a community like that. So I think I'm really interested in how can we take some of the practices that we know and love from traditional religious traditions and find ways of giving them a new home or giving them a new life for people who might never trust that institution again. So for example, I have a practice of a tech Sabbath. So kind of following the Judaic tradition of Friday night to Saturday sundown, I literally turn off my phone and my laptop. I put them in a drawer. I don't have kids or a full-time job, so I'm lucky enough to be doing this, right? But I literally light a candle and I sing a little song to myself and I put them away. And it's like going on holiday. It's fabulous. And that's taking a very traditional practice, but finding a way that it makes sense for my life. For me, it's not about eating something different maybe, or you are supposed to have sex on a Friday night, which, I think that's something.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, it's a wonderful tradition, which we should all struggle to keep. But I think there are ways of re-inhabiting these traditions.
So, but you've just stepped into a particular concern of mine, which is that if CrossFit becomes a religion, or following...
They already call themselves a religion run by biker gangs. That's literally the way they describe them. Yes.
So...
You might classify them as a cult.
You won my right. So they'll get you for that.
I know.
If, in fact, your religion becomes CrossFit or following a particular band across the country or Ultimate Frisbee or the great, what was the trains?
Millennial Train Project.
Right.
Yeah.
Then do you not, it's unlikely that those communities will replicate across generations, right? It's unlikely. I'm going to venture that the couple that meets at CrossFit and has a CrossFit wedding and then whose spirituality is CrossFit will have CrossFit children and CrossFit grandchildren.
You're joking. There are literally, they call them boxes.
I always argue, whatever you want to say about organized religion, one of the virtues is little Jewish or Catholic grandchild has some prayers and hymns and traditions in common with mom, grandmom, great-grandmom, etc. Is that going to happen with CrossFit?
It's already happening. People bring their kids. They have their, I had a friend who was moving to Ohio. She held her leaving party at the CrossFit box. People, seriously, they are bringing each other meals when they get diagnosed with breast cancer. They are fundraising together. It's really easy to see it kind of as a jokey thing, but these places are real communities of meaning and belonging for a lot of people. And I get frustrated with traditional religious faith sometimes for kind of looking down at them. And in many ways, they still have a lot to learn, I think. And particularly in terms of spiritual well-being and kind of, what happens when someone dies. Well, probably there's not, they even have workouts named after soldiers who have died. There's a big military community in CrossFit. They kind of honor the fallen with different workouts which they name after them. So I think we can't be so easy to make fun of them.
Can I respond? Oh, sorry. I just want to respond to Mark at some point, but go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think we can sort of give CrossFit its due while at the same time talking about the fact that there are all of these religious institutions in the United States which are struggling to reach this generation. And I think that, before they shutter their doors and, sort of give up because they get the sense that this is a generation that doesn't care about tradition, doesn't like authority, isn't into institutions, doesn't like their theology. I think that there are some real strategies that some of these institutions are adopting that are working. And so sort of before we kind of dismiss all of them, I would just say, just to give a couple of examples from my research, one of the things that some of these institutions are doing is really returning to the idea of neighborhood. So, many of you may be aware that, Catholic parishes used to actually have to go to the church in your neighborhood. And there was actually kind of a virtue to that. You didn't get to pick and choose, maybe. But for instance, an evangelical church that I visited in New Orleans, the pastor has people come to him and say, "Oh, we really want to join your church." And he said, "Well, that's fine, but we live in this neighborhood, and almost everybody here lives in this neighborhood, and just so you know, we're going to be serving this neighborhood. So if you want to drive 10 miles here, I'm not going to stop you, but I think you should find a church in your neighborhood." And I think that there's a lot to be said for that, because what happens in this particular community is that the people, unlike kind of the mega church model, which was drive 20 miles so you could get the preaching you wanted or the babysitting you wanted or the coffee shop you wanted, this is much more of a model of, you're going to run into these people Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. It's not just like church is separate from the rest of your life. And so those other people not only are there to help you when you need, something in your life, but they're also holding you accountable and sort of behaving, in a certain way and upholding the standards of the community. The other example that I think I'd just like to talk to people about is a church that I went to in New Jersey. It was a Black Baptist church, and the pastor said to me, "Well, the first thing that I did when I was thinking about encouraging young people to come here is I fired my wife." And I said, "Really? And how did that go over?" And what he said was that his wife had been in charge of the women's ministry at their church for 20 years, and she and her friends were in charge of it. and they could have been in charge for another 30 years. I mean, our lifespans are long, there's nothing about, being in charge of the women's ministry that's rocket science, And he said to her, you need to step down, and I need to go tap a 25-year-old who has come here a few times and say, you need to be here. We need you as part of this institution. And these are responsibilities that even if you're not married, even if you don't have a full-time job yet, even if you haven't finished college yet, and even if you're living with your parents, you are perfectly capable of doing all these things, and we value you enough in this community to say, here, it's yours. So I think that a lot of institutions are going to have to change their thinking about this generation, but I don't think that they're entirely lost.
What were you going to say, Jane?
I was just going to say that I think I was going to use a British example, which is that one of the things now is that generation of millennials doesn't know the prayers that its parents and grandparents know. So, sociologists like Grace Davey have talked about the fact that my generation, I'm 52, and probably your generation, you're 40. I'm so not a millennial. Has vicarious religion, right? So if they go to, in the Christian tradition, if they go to a baptism, they can probably know a pretty familiar hymn and the Lord's Prayer. So that would be my siblings. But my nieces and nephews, who are millennials, really don't know that because it's just not in them. So I think I'm talking about this very specific situation of England where there's very low church going indeed. I think it's now 6%. But nevertheless, I think that speaks to I think the generational thing is one thing, and succession planning and being very determined about succession planning is one answer. Absolutely.
So I was going to ask Jordan and Casper for their take on that, right? I mean, you're both part of communities that, in all sorts of ways, English, gay, Muslim, but confronting modernity, right? In which your fellow members might be reluctant to set foot inside a house of worship, or even to encounter the tradition, even if it's not within the walls of the house of worship. Do you feel that your job as activists is to help bring them in? Is that something you think about? Do you have an evangelical component to it? And if so, are these strategies that you're hearing, does what Naomi said strike you as having potential, or is that just missing a point?
I think that I want to return to something that Casper mentioned about meaning and belonging. I think that that's really what I'm seeing folks trying to find, whether it's through a traditional form that they've reinterpreted or changed to their own lifestyle, or through finding other religions or finding other places that they can find that meaning, belonging. So I guess I would say that in my activist work, it's not necessarily so much about bringing them back to the institution. It's more about bringing them into practices that feel right for them and that carry them through a lot of the more horrific things that happen. I guess to say, because a lot of times, for instance, particularly Muslims facing Islamophobia, whether they are very practicing or not, they may be stereotyped based on skin color because of the racialization of Islam, or they may, still wear the hijab and be the targets of that kind of violence, whether they are very conservative or not. So I guess I am trying to make 2 points, is that in one way you want to find meaning and belonging, and in the other way you want to find solidarity with folks of your religious faith, even if you are on the other end of the spectrum.
I would add to that is, I think denominations and actually traditions matter less as a dividing line to our generation. I think a lot of people, one of the reasons why maybe going to a particular place feels strange is that it's saying I'm choosing this but not anything else. So one of the most beautiful expressions of kind of millennial belonging, meaning-making, and actually embodying a faith community is in Washington, D.C. It's called the Sanctuaries, and they call themselves a diverse arts community with soul. And the idea is that what sits at the very heart of the community is the creative process. And whatever spiritual tradition or practice or history that you want to bring into that is absolutely welcome. And it's all about meeting the other through the creative process. So you have, kids from Southeast who have grown up with a lot of community, but maybe not a lot of opportunity, collaborating, on a workshop on Jewish mysticism and hip hop with someone, from Boston who's just come in to work for the federal government with lots of opportunity, but in a new town without a lot of community. So ways of meeting these different needs, crossing racial and religious bridges, for me, those are the most exciting ways of honoring tradition nonetheless, but also directly meeting the needs and really kind of getting away from the pew mentality of showing up and, surviving and then leaving.
I was going to say that maybe to summarize what you just said, taking from improv, the yes and model, the idea that we can have, some parts of our tradition and other parts, or taking from other traditions.
I have a final question, but I'm going to ask each of them to answer it, and then I hope that all of you, I don't want all of you to have questions, but I want, I want questions to come from y'all. And the question I have is, I'd like to know if a spiritual but not religious person, or let me just say someone who doesn't even describe herself as that, but is just generally questing, encounters you and you suggest, well, maybe you want to come to church, or maybe you want to come to this arts experience, or maybe, and they say, well, why should I? What's in it for me? And they say, I have a rich life, I have a significant other, and my grades are good, or making good money at my job, and I don't feel that need. Do you at that point stop and say, okay, well, if you don't have the need, fine, or do you have a reason that you think the life of this person would be enhanced by being part of this community? Now, I should pause here and say, for a lot of people in the clergy, the answer would be, well, because it's true. Right? The reason you should come to my church is because you need the word of the Lord, or my mosque, or my synagogue, or my zendo, or whatever it is. There are truths there that you are not at liberty to ignore, son. I don't imagine that's your answer. Why would you encourage?
I've never heard that question.
No one's ever said, why should I do this?
No. People want, they hunger for this. It's everywhere, and what we're offering is so parched, I've never heard anyone say, well, my life is just fine, And I don't mean that in a sense of like a neediness, but I just, it's at least, I speak for everyone, but speaking for myself, when I post things on Facebook about this kind of stuff, people are like, yes, people are really hungry for it. That's just a very unfamiliar experience to me. The kind of frame of, going to evangelize to someone is not in my experience.
Yeah, I think similarly, I feel like I've gotten that question very few times, and even if someone identifies very strongly as an atheist, there's always a discussion that happens about, like, why do you think? And maybe I'm not interacting with the types of people that would shut down that conversation, but I feel like a lot of people are looking particularly for ritual, again, kind of returning to the idea of the difficulties of everyday life, whether that's as extreme as living in a place where, your fellow brothers and sisters are, being stopped and frisked, or on the other end, just, searching for meaning when you work 60 hours a week. Those kind of things are pervasive in our society now. We have to deal with them in some way, and the processing, I think, comes from having ritual. Not necessarily coerced ritual, not necessarily knocking on the door and saying, like, you must come to us, and we have all your answers, but more sort of finding a way to make space for that in your own life.
Yeah, I mean, if a student shows interest, I try and assess why and how and what might be appropriate for them. So it may be that a favorite professor of theirs is preaching, so inviting them to church would be appropriate because of that. It may be that they love drama, so we've got Anna DeVere Smith coming as a visiting artist in the fall at Memorial Church at Stanford, so I'd invite them to come to her performance. Or if they're interested in contemplation, Stanford now has this amazingly beautiful contemplation center called Windover, which has these wonderful paintings by Nathan Oliveira in it. It's, I think, the only device-free space in Silicon Valley. And the students do want to go there, and we're actually now learning, they don't just want to go there, they want to learn what to do there. So we now run silent yoga in the Contemplation Center in the mornings, and we are now teaching them how to meditate and contemplate, and we're bringing different sorts of people in to do that. So my answer would always be pretty tailor-made. I think it wouldn't be, you should come to church ever. It would be, what are you looking for, and how can I help you find a way into it? To it.
Now, you wrote a book that has a subtitle that indicates you think they should come back, or that it's a good to help bring them back.
Oh, see, now I thought I was going to get out of this being a
Why
journalist.
Why do you think so?
Well, let me answer it from the perspective of a journalist, because I will say that I interviewed lots of people, and the reason that they were attracted to the idea of going back to many times traditional religious institutions, albeit ones that had adopted certain strategies, was that they wanted something that didn't look like the rest of their lives. And in that sense, I'm a little bit echoing what was already said here, but I think a lot of religious institutions are in the habit of trying to, be high tech, of going, let's have throwing, hundreds of thousands of dollars and hours into trying to be the hip place. You know, I don't, if you've ever seen, some of the musical acts that you will find in some churches today, but, and synagogues do this too, and it's everywhere. But I have yet to meet somebody who said, "Oh, it was the technology that brought me back." I mean, it doesn't happen. And so I think what religious institutions can offer is the ritual, as you were saying, is the break from their daily lives, but is also a sense of what you were talking about before. This is something that my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents did, and I might want it for my children too. And we get so little of that timelessness. I was saying to Mark earlier that I've become really interested recently in kind of the thinning of our families and how a lot of people don't have the experience because of our low birth rates of having big extended families anymore. And I feel like one of the things that religious institutions can be, some people will say this is a bad thing sometimes when it gets too tribal, but one of the things they can be is an extended family. And I think a lot of young adults, especially those who are in this kind of really mobile, emerging, adulthood part of their lives are longing for that.
Thank you. So, ma'am, do we have a microphone? We do. So wait for the gentleman with the microphone to come so that we can record you for devices that won't be allowed in Windover at Stanford. Yes.
I was in the deep dive session on terrorism at Greenwald just before coming here. And yes, it was focused on young Muslims, but it strikes me that given what happened in Charleston 10 days ago, it's not all that dissimilar. And I just wondered if anybody on the panel is running against younger people who are suffering through some crisis of identity which might drive them toward more extreme actions and beliefs, and if you have ways to counter that. Because one of the things that came out on that deep dive into terrorism was that there needs to be a counter-narrative to bring people back. And I just wondered if any of you have run into those situations where somebody could veer off the deep end.
One of the communities that I went to profile was an Islamic community in Southern California, and one of the things that they had actually done was they're trying to counter some of the radical forms of Islam that are growing in prisons. And so they're putting out their own literature to explain what they think Islam is really about, and to try to tamp down some of the radicalism that they see growing there. And I think that that is something that actually occasionally will make some Muslims in America want to stay away from mosques, is their concern that they will be seen as part of a radical movement. And so I think you have a lot of leaders out there who are saying, we don't just need to say we're not radicals. We need to say, look, this is what we really believe Islam is about.
This doesn't quite answer your question, but I think it shines a light in a kind of sideways way. I think in an age where, at least speaking for myself, I'm constantly projecting myself through a status update, or there's a lot of presenting myself to the world. It can be exhausting. And I think when you look at figures of loneliness, of depression, of the lack of friendships that people have, I think it's like a staggering number of people can't even say they have one or two really important friendships in their life. That kind of isolation leads often to drastic behavior, whether it's suicide or violence against others. And I think I'm really interested in particularly working with white people to open conversations about mental health, about suicide, about racism, in ways that people feel that they can share more vulnerably in a way that maybe everyday connections they can't. And so one of the things I hope to do with the communities that I've been talking about is kind of opening those conversations about justice, about these kind of more trickier issues, which often we don't really want to talk about. We just want to talk about the shiny stuff. So I think there's a real job to do there, actually, in terms of making these spaces which are already bringing people together, but allowing kind of a new level of intimacy to emerge.
Yes, in the beige. But wait for the microphone.
I guess this is for Casper or for any of you. look to comparative religion scholars when you're trying to understand the belief systems of millennials?
Ooh, I'm going to say something a little controversial. I think the interfaith model of dialogue is kind of dying. I don't think it's very helpful anymore to most of us. I'm definitely interested in kind of comparative religion in terms of, I'm in a divinity school, so I have to take classes and that kind of thing. Particularly to see what can I learn. So, for example, I have a good friend who's an atheist Jew in school with me, and we're going to lead an 8-month class reading all 7 Harry Potter novels as a sacred text. So using the kind of very Jewish style of debate over a text, but we're just changing it to a different text. She did it with Jane Eyre last year, and it was fabulously successful because I think, again, people are looking to really engage with these kind of old practices, but and I'm hoping that people will have exactly what you said with the Gospels, with like, well, okay, we did it with this text. What other text could I treat as sacred? Presuming that what makes a text sacred isn't the text itself, but the way a community reads it. So I think there's so much that we can learn, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I'm just trying to give the microphone gentleman a workout here.
Hi, my name is Scott Weinberg. I live in California, and I have been spending a lot of time with millennials, and I identify a lot with that myself, creating my own religion, spending time with an Orthodox Jewish temple, and then also sitting in ayahuasca ceremonies. And how do you see the role of this attraction to drugs as an awakener that's growing substantially in the US in many ways, a lot of statistics showing this as well? And what practices would you say are the core ones to complement those that you would draw out of the other spiritual traditions?
Are you looking for good drug recommendations? Is that
Because Mark's your man.
Yeah, I'm so not your man. But no, it's a good question. So yeah, the question of substances and religions. Jane, you work on a college campus.
But not actually in my remit. Yeah, I mean, the two don't come together as far as I know on Stanford campus. The two exist, but the two don't come together.
Nobody?
I have something that I just spoke, so I don't want to...
Go for it.
Go for it.
Well, I hear what you're saying. Actually, a good friend of mine in the UK is launching an organization to do just that. He thinks that using mind-altering substances is the way for people to experience a more intense reality, and that changes people's behavior. This is where I sound really boring. I have no experience with drugs, but the only time where I would consider doing it, I think, is if I was in a situation, like people will travel to Latin America or something and will engage in practices which are led by people who have done this for generations. I think there's easier ways to do it, but I know it's out there as a question in a lot of people's minds. Yeah.
I mean, I will say that I think that if you look back at some of the origins of some of these attempts in the 60s, right, and 70s. Part of what you can see historically is they never got it together in any sort of self-perpetuating way, right? Like the sacred texts were those horrible Carlos Castaneda books, right, which are unreadable and made up, and they don't stand the test of time, right? We haven't seen the charismatic leaders, the sacred texts. They might be coming. This would be my take as a journalist, right? Is they might be coming, but in the past 40 or 50 years, you haven't seen those other pieces that would fit together to build traditions. That would be my guess.
Can I just, while we're on the topic of sacred texts, I'm sorry, I'm going to veer off a little bit here, but since it's been talked about a little bit, I was talking to, I don't know if he's here, but I was talking to this nice Buddhist baby boomer earlier today. There he is, and he can tell you if I've misrepresented what he's said. But I think one of the problems that a lot of millennials have is that they haven't been introduced to the traditional sacred texts, which is to say, I mean, your joke about the Gospels, they really haven't read them. They were not, a lot of them were not taken to religious institutions as children, and so they have nothing that they're rebelling against. And I think that sometimes removes a little bit of the purpose, and often I think we're kind of talking past the point when we're they're trying to make up new things, but without any sense of what came before them. And I think one role that we could have, even if that they eventually reject the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, like even if they decide these are all not for me, it seems to me that there is something worthwhile about having them have a sense, and whether that comes in the form of, a college course that's on the Bible, or whether that comes in the form of a religious education, I think it's a little bit unfair because they seem to be sort of having to go out in the world and just create everything from scratch. And it's a little bit hard to do that when you're 25.
Sorry, thank you. I also just want to veer in that direction too, because I think that there is sometimes a dichotomy set up between like millennials and tradition. And I think you articulated it correctly in the way that maybe they aren't exposed, but are trying to dive back in. I found like a lot of people trying to relate to the Quran, but are relating to it in a new way because of the people interpreting it. Not necessarily because they don't believe in the Quranic teachings, but they don't believe in the way that it's written, because it's gone through so many interpretations of different schools, of different cultural backgrounds, of their parents' way of teaching it down, which can be in some ways hodgepodge. And I think that sometimes it's not the tradition that seems scary, but the thing that it's come through has also been scary.
I was just going to say, we run something at Stanford called Fellowship for Religious Encounter, which students can apply to join. And they just agree to meet every Wednesday night. And we sort of lightly oversee it, but essentially they are teaching each other about their own sacred traditions or their non-tradition and why they have no tradition. And it happens over a meal. And it's very, they love it because they're learning from each other. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, with the sunglasses on your head.
Thank you so much for your comments, Tamara Rems. And I'm very blessed to be involved in philanthropy in this space, particularly in the Jewish space. And we do two things that I think are really interesting, which frame a question. So we both invest in institutions to really model and push them to innovate. And we innovate to reach individuals and then connect them to each other and to institutions. And so my question is two things. One, kind of what do you see as the role of the internet and technology? I understand it's not the thing that's bringing people into the church necessarily, but as a connector, as a content provider to either build people's connection or sustain. And what do you see the role as philanthropy? I'd just love for you to speak to that.
I'd love to talk about that. Particularly for LGBT Muslims, like the first way that I found that group of people was the internet, because we're geographically sparse and may not actually be able to articulate that in our communities to be able to say like, oh, I'm queer and Muslim, or we may be struggling with that. So things like Facebook and other social media platforms are really helpful in creating communities when people are, as Casper was saying, isolated either geographically or because of the values of the space that they're in. So I guess I see the role of the internet. I'm pro-internet, basically. That's what I'm telling you. But also I think that there are creative ways to use the internet for dialogue about all of the different subjects that we've talked about, because now there are, I'm part of a Facebook group or several Facebook groups for Muslims that are for progressive values, not the organization, but for a variety of causes. And we have discussions about these exact topics just over comments, right? And it's really helpful in that way. So that's what I wanted to say.
Mm-hmm. On philanthropy, one of the biggest challenges for a lot of these communities is that what they're selling is community. Mm-hmm. And what most people like me and my age are not used to paying for is community. We kind of expect it to be there. And it doesn't happen by itself. And so a lot of these communities don't have a financial model that fits. And so a lot of people like me will happily pay $20 for a yoga class, but contribute to a hat for like some potluck meal where we talked about the meaning of life, that sounds surreal, So I think that's a really big paradigm challenge is, and this is actually happening in churches as well amongst millennials and their donation rates, it's lower. This is just not a muscle that we've practiced as much. So I think there's a real interesting challenge there, and philanthropy can't just fill that gap all the time, but finding what models might work, I think is something that I would be really excited in.
I want somebody from this quadrant. So in the green shirt back there, yes.
I asked this question last year to a panel where Leon West-Latier was on. And I'm a PhD psychologist, a very strong cultural reform Jew, and an atheist. And I said, Leon, can I be a good Jew without believing in God? And we talked here for 50 minutes, and the concept of God has not come up. And I think what's happening with younger people is there's no value proposition. And when you said, forgot your name, but when you said, have these individuals read the Bible, the Testament, the Talmud, whatever, every other line is, God said this, if you do that, this is going to happen. If you don't do that, there's no value to a 30-year-old for that to happen. So what's the position of God going forward?
It's a great question.
Well, I'm just curious, what did Leon tell you?
Leon actually, we started walking around campus, he said, and he started parsing, he said, well, I think, but I'm not so sure, and I said,
so I'll actually tell you.
Leon, we all turned into people we used to make fun of 30 years ago.
I'll answer the question for you.
Speak on behalf of God.
So I'm going to speak on behalf of Jews, actually, which is they're more
The
likely
same
to,
thing, right?
They're more likely to talk back. Yes, you can be a good Jew without believing in God. In fact, what Jews are called on to do in most of Jewish scripture is not believe in God, but do other things. So that's a different conversation. But I'm surprised Leon didn't tell you that. He should know better. But anyway, to the question he posed, which is, without the value, do they need value propositions?
I want to hear Jane answer this question.
Well, I mean, I think some people do need that. Some people do need that. And, but I belong to a tradition that is probably the closest Christian tradition to Judaism, namely Anglicanism. Because, you know, the Reformation happened, loads of people in the 16th century killed each other in Europe about very small things, about how, you know, the nature of the bread and wine at Eucharist. They were willing to kill each other about what that meant, okay? And this guy called Thomas Cranmer in England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, looked over there and thought, we don't want to go there. So he wrote a prayer book. And he just said, all everyone has to do is show up at the same time and say the same prayers. It's called the Book of Common Prayer. So there's a kind of ritualistic element to my form of Christianity that I suspect is not true of other Protestants, but might be true for some Orthodox and some forms of Catholicism. So I think the answer is both and, right? And I think sometimes when we're talking about these things, we tend to only emphasize the belief part. And I, 3 hours ago, just interviewed Richard Dawkins, and I would want to call Richard, I didn't say this in the interview, I would want to call Richard a Protestant atheist, because it's very much about what you believe, but religion is, for me, many other things besides what you believe. It serves the purpose of community, it serves the purpose of rituals around the life cycle. It serves the purpose of calendar, thank you, time, how you mark time. For some people, it's an ethical marker and an ethical guide. That's not to say people who aren't religious aren't ethical. I'm not saying that.
No,
Yeah.
but it's also important. I did mention God early on, and I said that one thing you should note about all these millennial nuns is that many of them believe in God. So I think, you know, they're praying to God. I mean,
Yeah.
we have Alan Cooperman here, so he could tell you.
What the Pew Report would say.
The man who wrote it.
No,
is
no.
right
The
here.
question of how many Jews believe in God is different than how many millennials believe in God. But I will say that I think one of the things we're talking about here is the lack of affiliation with institutions and communities, because for a lot of people, God is a personal thing, and they're already there. The value proposition for them is, why do I need to go pray with other people?
I was going to say, it's not even just in communities or institutions, but even identities, right? I mean, I think a lot of parents and grandparents, so to speak, would be satisfied with just the kids saying, yeah, I do consider myself Presbyterian. I don't go much, I don't love that church, but I own that identity. And what you're seeing on the part of a lot of millennials is they don't even want the identity. They might even believe the creed, but they don't want the label.
But there's something extra to this. I don't know. I came into divinity school being like, definitely an atheist. But the God I rejected is not what I understand God to be now. And that's been I think, maybe this is just like for queer kids especially, but like God was like angry and hated me and, you know, was telling me to whatever. And when I hear professors who I adore describe in, you know, whether it's in literature or the natural landscape or the experience of love, if that's what God means, then I'm like, I'm in. But I would never use that language publicly because that's not what we hear when we hear the word God. So I'm really interested, I'm writing my thesis about a language for God for non-religious people, because I think there's a real opportunity of reclaiming, because there's also something about that word which no other word quite reaches. You know, even love, I'm going to be ordained as a Unitarian Universalist, and like we love love, like that's our go-to word. But like it doesn't quite, you know, it doesn't quite reach what God does, for better or worse. So I think there's still some work to be done with that.
Can I just bring one other thing in? Because while everyone's been talking, I've been thinking about William James' Varieties of Religious Experience, a brilliant book. And so I think for some people it is about a sort of certain kind of individualistic experience that they would want to attribute to God or some sense of the transcendent. So I don't think we should leave that out either. But sometimes people then begin to want community, right? So this is, I would also say that although we're talking about millennials, this is I'm a historian, this is a long-standing thing, actually. I mean, William James wrote that in the first decade of the 20th century.
Sir, here.
Paul Schindler, and thank you for your discussion and opinions here. To kind of add to this, can you speak to the dangers, at least I see it as a danger, of consumerism?
That's a danger that a lot of millennials talk about. I mean, even though they engage in it, they also don't want to just be seen as taking from faith or taking from religious communities. They want to be seen as giving back. And so one of the things that I was talking about, you know, the big bands and all the entertainment and everything, and this goes back to the philanthropy question, you know, how much should we be sort of bribing millennials to kind of come back with all of this stuff, I think is a concern for them as well. And, you know, I think one of the solutions there is really about how we bring people up in religious institutions. Mark and I were talking earlier about how, especially American religious institutions, but a lot of modern ones, cater to you at every age. You know, there's like the 3-year-old class, there's the kindergarten, you know, service, there's the teen service. And you get the impression after going through all of this and then doing this in college too, that religion is sort of meant to speak to you at the exact point that you are in your life, and that you can sort of tune out everyone from other generations who has other issues. I mean, the college religious experience is sort of hilarious in some ways. I mean, they give you the food, they give you the religious service across the street, everyone there is your same age group, you have these really intelligent people speaking at the front, and you're totally unprepared for what religious life looks like after that, because it's this kind of messy. Sometimes people are doing what they're supposed to, and sometimes they're not. And you become this consumer by that point. And then I think it's really hard to get out of that habit.
Yeah, I mean, that's my principal obsession, right? Is that I think religion is in many ways what people come to as a check on when consumerism isn't giving them meaning. And that's not to say we don't need stuff to live, and it's not to say we shouldn't be grateful for the bounty that our markets have provided, and you know that having, you know, an uninvaded, relatively safe country gives us. But at the end of the day, like buying more stuff doesn't provide a lot of meaning. And I was just interviewing an order of nuns in New York City, the Sisters of Life, and when you know, a lot of them are in their 20s, nuns, N-U-N-S, the ones with habits. And they have blue habits. You know, and if you want to know why they're coming, I mean, faith, they will foreground that. I mean, they wanted a lifestyle that wasn't about earning money and spending money. You know, that's so much of it. So
can we?
Oh, yeah.
There's more things. Do you want?
Oh, well, I could give you the example of yoga at the cathedral, because we didn't charge people. We said you can give a donation if you want. No one wanted to give a donation because they thought yoga in a church should be free, right? So then we began to think, where are they? So we began to engage very intensely with them, with the people who came to do yoga, and what they wanted to do was be of service. So then we began to run days in which they could be of service in various ways. And we also began to say, okay, let's have a regular yoga-thon in which you do pay something, but that money all goes to the preschool, which we happened to run, which was for the kids from the bottom of the hill in the Tenderloin. We were at the top in Nob Hill, San Francisco. And that was completely interesting to them. So just giving money to what looked like, although wasn't, believe me, a rich cathedral, was uninteresting because that fit into a kind of consumery thing. But when we began to wrap it up in terms of service, completely different.
I also just wanted to make a comment, because I think when we get into discussions about monetary consumerism, Islam, I think, has a different relationship to that than Christianity, particularly, because of the way that zakat is structured, 2% of your income, rather than, you know, giving a certain amount at every service, et cetera. But also, for instance, right now, there's a lot of folks talking about how, I think it's Coca-Cola did some sort of advertising for Ramadan, and about like how people are reacting to that. And I feel like from various communities of Muslims, there's a huge reaction to the making of us into new consumers, right? So new consumers of products that are not even related necessarily. So I don't have a total conclusion about that, but I guess I wanted to say that I think that the idea of service and the idea of philanthropy over the course of the year and over the course of whole lives, rather than trying to make us, consume religious objects or give to a particular location, is more involved in the Islamic faith.
We have time for. Did you want to say something?
Really
Yes.
quickly.
We're going to hear from you, and then we have time for one more question.
Okay,
Yeah.
just because it's so fascinating. So Soul Cycle is the spinning class, right? Which costs $35 a class. Traditionally, at least in Protestant churches, there's, especially in New England, you could pay to have your own pew. So to sit at the very front was status, you paid for it. Some families really still sit in their kind of familial pews. Soul Cycle, the bikes are in rows facing the instructor. You can, on Monday, the booking opens, you book which classes you want to go to. For $10,000, you get access to book it on Sunday so that you can sit in the front row. So there's these same kind of consumption mentalities within religion that happens now in these same secular spaces. But I think one of the biggest themes for the kind of millennial communities that we've been looking at, the role of being able to contribute and create whatever it happens to be, whether it's a Shabbat luck or whether it's some other sort of community gathering. It's a huge draw for people because they want to contribute, they want to create.
That was definitely worth it for that fact about being able to buy your pew at the Soul. I'm so glad we took it. So, wait, everyone's point. Oh, yeah, Emma gets it. Okay. I don't know if they were pointing at you, but they're pointing that direction. And
I'll take it. So my name is Emma Green. I write for The Atlantic. I'm also a religion reporter. And religion and same-sex marriage is in the news. I'm not saying that in reference to this.
Something happened with that?
Crazy. I'm actually not referring to the Supreme Court, though, because the Episcopal Church just today finally approved the having of same-sex ceremonies in Episcopal churches, which is a significant move in mainline Protestantism. So what I'm curious about is the sexual politics of millennials and how this maps into the rejection of traditional institutions by some millennials. So on the one hand, you have large spread support for same-sex marriage among millennials, in general sort of more openness towards people who are LGBT, in general more sexual openness, but there are trends that cut away from that, millennials who want to be in relationships, millennials who are gravitating towards those megachurches or those conservative evangelical churches. So there's sort of a cross trend here. How do you think that millennial sexual politics play into this lack of affiliation?
It's huge, but you should go first.
No, go.
I think, okay, yeah. Well, obviously I'm English, so I only moved here 3 years ago, but I think one of the huge influences, and really Alan is the expert here, but one of the huge influences in why there was such strong disaffiliation was because Christianity became to mean right-wing, megachurch, evangelical, judgmental, nasty. And I think that's one of the...
Can I just interrupt? Because I think even in the Church of England,
yes,
one of the visible signs that put a lot of people off was bishops in the House of Lords lining up to vote against gay marriage.
Totally. Or ordination of women, same thing. Yeah.
But I think just similar.
So I think that was absolutely the image here as well. I think now, at least half of evangelical pastors are freaking out and realizing that millennials across denominations, it's much more swinging in support of something like same-sex marriage. Not on issues like abortion, for example. So it's not uniform. But I think there's a lot of worry within the evangelical community of being kind of on the wrong side of history and catching up very quickly.
Yeah, I guess I want to talk a little bit about discomfort, because I think that this discussion, maybe because there's not so much of a hierarchy. For instance, I know openly gay moms that will perform marriages and would perform them before any of this discussion really came to the Supreme Court.
You said imams, not moms.
Yes,
right?
imams, yeah.
Because I know openly gay moms who will perform marriages, but...
I would too, but so perhaps because of the non-hierarchical setup, although that could be argued that certain sects are more hierarchical in Islam, which is what I'm familiar with, there's still a spectrum of folks, even of older generations, but I think that what is true across the board of millennials going towards cutting across the trend, and also older folks in Islam, is the discomfort with talking about sexual politics at all. And I think that is for the first step, almost. Bringing this, although, for instance, for me, gay marriage was not my greatest, issue on top of everything, LGBT suicide and et cetera, was more important to me. I think what it did was, even if it made conversations happen that were negative or full of spite or hate or what all of those things, it brought the conversation to places that were not talking about it before because of this deep discomfort. And so I believe that as people continue to talk about that, as people freak out and find out, there's a lot of people that support this in younger generations, that will turn the tide and, create different opinions.
When's your wedding, Casper?
May 14th.
May 14th. All right, mazel tov. Thank you all very much.